In 1929, a young German doctor strapped a nurse to an operating table, told her he was about to numb her arm, and then quietly numbed his own instead. She only worked it out when she noticed the tube was coming out of him. He kept going. Today, we're looking at very smart people who read the warning and decided it didn't apply to them. Number 1. April 1986. Anatoly Dyatlov is deputy chief engineer at the Chernobyl plant, and he is not a fool. He's a career nuclear man with 2 decades behind him, the kind of engineer other engineers step aside for in corridors. That night, he's running a safety test on reactor number 4. A test, specifically, about what happens when the power goes out. The reactor doesn't want to cooperate. Power drops far lower than the test needs, down into a range where the machine gets twitchy and hard to read. Alexander Akimov, the shift chief, wants to abort. Reasonable. Every instinct in that room says abort. Dyatlov says continue. When the objections keep coming, he makes it clear he can find a different shift to do it, which in the Soviet nuclear industry was not a small threat. Akimov and Toptunov go back to their panels and bring the power up. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because this is the part nobody puts on the poster. The RBMK reactor had 2 features that were, let's say, ambitious. First, it got more reactive as its cooling water turned to steam. Most reactors do the opposite, which is the entire point of most reactors. Second, the control rods, the things you shove in to stop the reaction, had graphite tips. So for the first moment of an emergency shutdown, hitting the panic button briefly made the reaction stronger. Read that again. The brake pedal added gas for the first half second. Soviet authorities knew about both of these things. They classified them. The men at that panel were operating a machine whose most important quirk had been marked secret from the people operating it. Later reviews by the International Nuclear Agency couldn't even find evidence that running the reactor in that low-power state was formally forbidden. Dyatlov absorbed about 390 rem that night. That's a number where survival is roughly a coin flip. He got 10 years for criminal mismanagement, served about 4, and was let out early in 1990 because of what the radiation had done to him. Then he sat down and wrote a book. His argument, right to the end, never changed. Don't blame the men at the panel. Blame the people who never told them what they were standing next to. He has a point. He also overrode the one man in the room who wanted to stop. Both of those are true at the same time, and that's why this story never quite settles. Number 2. Stockton Rush was not a tourist. Aerospace engineering degree, pilot, founder of his own deep-sea company. He designed the submersible himself, and this matters, he got in it. Every single time. Whatever else you say about the man, he never asked anyone to take a risk he wasn't taking beside them. Which makes this one hard to laugh at. So let's laugh at the equipment instead. The vessel was steered with a wireless game controller. Not a ruggedized marine version of one. A Logitech F710, about $30, released in 2010. The kind of thing that lives in a drawer with a tangled headset and no batteries in it. 2.5 miles down, in the cold, that was the steering wheel. And the hull was carbon fibre. Now, carbon fibre is a wonderful material. It's astonishingly strong when you pull it. What it is not famous for is being squeezed by an entire ocean, over and over on a schedule. The Coast Guard's investigation found that the company had been warned about exactly this. Carbon fibre and compression at those depths was unproven, which in engineering is a polite way of saying nobody actually knows and nobody wants to find out with people inside. David Lockridge was OceanGate's own director of marine operations. He looked at that hull and saw visible flaws in the fibre, the kind of small imperfections that don't stay small once you start pressure cycling them. He wrote it up. He said afterwards that he'd only joined the project on the understanding that the sub would be classed, meaning independently certified by an outside body with no stake in your enthusiasm. It was never classed. Lockridge was fired in 2018. He testified later that something happening was, in his word, inevitable. The company's answer to all of this was a real-time monitoring system. Sensors inside the hull that would listen to the material and warn you before it gave up. Which sounds impressive until you sit with the concept for about 4 seconds. That's not a safety system. That's a smoke detector bolted inside the fireplace. Rush described the noises the hull made under pressure as attention-grabbing pops. He explained them as individual fibers snapping. He said this out loud to paying passengers as reassurance. Then, in July 2022, at the end of a dive to the Titanic, there was a bang. Not a pop. A bang, loud enough to travel through the whole vessel. One of the people on board said afterwards that you'd have to be barely conscious not to find that concerning. They kept diving. Investigators later found that the hull behaved differently after that bang. Whatever happened in 2022 changed the material, and the machine carried that change with it into every dive that followed. In June 2023, it went down again with 5 people aboard, including Rush. There was no return trip. The Coast Guard's final report ran 335 pages. Its conclusion was that all of this was avoidable. Design flaws, weak oversight, no certification, no real inspections, no proper maintenance, and a safety culture the report described as toxic. The most brutal detail in the whole file isn't the controller or the carbon fibre. It's that the man who overruled every expert was sitting in the same seat as the people who trusted him. He wasn't gambling with other people's lives. He was gambling with everyone's, his own included, which is somehow both better and very much worse. Number 3. Roger Boisoli's job at Morton Thiokol was the rubber seals in the shuttle's booster rockets. That was it. That was the whole beat. Nobody on Earth knew those seals better, and 6 months before the launch, he wrote a memo to his vice president of engineering warning of, quote, a catastrophe of the highest order, the loss of human life. That memo existed, in writing, with a date on it. The night before the launch, Florida went cold, not chilly. Cold enough that ice formed on the pad overnight. The booster rockets were rated to fly at 39 degrees Fahrenheit and above. Launch morning came in at 36, 15 degrees colder than any shuttle launch before it. Boisoli and 4 other engineers got on a teleconference with NASA and said, don't. Cold makes the seals stiff, stiff seals don't seal, and that joint is the one place you cannot afford a gap. Thiokol's own management agreed with them and formally recommended a delay. NASA pushed back hard. By several accounts, pressured. So Thiokol's managers went off and held a second meeting, and they deliberately left the engineers out of it. Before the vote, General Manager Jerry Mason told the other vice presidents to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. I'll be fair to him. He almost certainly meant think about the bigger picture. But some sentences escaped the room they were set in and become monuments. They approved the launch. 73 seconds. 5 months later, Richard Feynman sat at a press conference with one of those seals, a small clamp and a glass of ice water. He squeezed the rubber, dropped it in the ice, pulled it out, and it stayed squashed. It had lost its spring. That was the entire investigation, performed in about 15 seconds by a man holding a drink. It took me 3 attempts to understand that demonstration, which tells you something about both of us. Number 4. Alfred Wegener spent his career being laughed at. In 1912, he suggested that the continents move, that they'd once been jammed together and had slowly drifted apart. Geology's response, broadly, was that's adorable. Where's the engine? He didn't have one. He was right anyway, and he'd be waiting decades past his own lifetime for anybody to say so. In 1930, he led an expedition onto the Greenland ice sheet. 15 men, 3 planned stations, real science. Measure the thickness of the ice, keep weather records right through the winter. The middle station was called Eismitti, which means exactly what it sounds like. Ice middle. 400 kilometers inland, right in the middle of the sheet. And Eismitt had a problem. 2 meteorologists were sitting out there without enough supplies to get through the winter. Someone had to haul provisions 400 kilometers across a sheet of ice in autumn behind dogs. Wegener went himself. 50 years old, expedition leader, and he took the worst job on the list. The storm started almost straight away. Of the 15 who set out, all but 3 were forced to turn back. Wegener, Fritz Loewe, and a Greenlander named Rasmus Wilhelmsen kept going. Loewe's feet were in a bad state by the end. They made it. They handed over the supplies. Loewe stayed at the station because he physically could not go any further. 2 days later, on the 1st of November, the men at Eismitt celebrated Wegener's 50th birthday in a hole in the ice, 400 kilometers from anything. And then he decided to head back to the coast rather than eat the station's rations all winter, which is either extraordinary discipline or a man who cannot sit still. He and Wilhelmsen left the same day. There was one sled. Wilhelmsen rode it. Wegener went on skis. They never reached the coast. A search party found him the following May, roughly halfway, sewn carefully into his sleeping bag with his skis planted upright beside him. Wilhelmsen had clearly done that, marked the spot, and carried on alone. No trace of him was ever found. Continental drift became accepted science in the 1960s. Wegener had been right for about 50 years by then, and had spent precisely none of them being told so. Number 5. Sweden, 1897. Salomon August André is going to reach the North Pole by balloon, and the entire country is watching. This is not a private hobby. It's a national project, with sponsors, press, and a send-off. The balloon was called the Eagle, 20.5 meters across, 3 layers of Chinese silk wrapped in a net of Italian hemp soaked in petroleum jelly to keep the gas where it belonged. It leaked. During the tests, before they ever left, it leaked. André knew. The steering system is the part I genuinely love, because it's clever right up until it isn't. Long, heavy ropes trailed from the basket down onto the ice. Friction from the ropes would slow the balloon relative to the wind, and that difference in speed would let a sail actually bite and angle their course. A good idea. Completely dependent on the ropes staying attached. On launch, the lower sections of all 3 drag ropes came off, immediately, before they were properly out over the water. So now they're not flying a steerable airship. They're in a bag of gas going wherever the weather fancies, and they've just shed the weight that was holding them low. So they climb higher than planned and start bleeding hydrogen at altitude. 2 days. That's how long the flight to the pole lasted. Then the Eagle came down on the pack ice, and 3 men started walking. What happened next was a blank space for 33 years. In August 1930, Norwegian hunters landed on a small, ice-covered island called Kvitoya and found the last camp. The diaries were there, the logbooks, the camera, with film still good enough to develop. That last part gets me every time. They'd been photographing the whole thing. Somebody had to stand in a darkroom in 1930 and slowly bring up pictures taken by men who'd been gone for 3 decades. Honestly, I found half of today's list because somebody dropped it in the comments at 2 in the morning. So if you know one, an engineer, a doctor, an explorer, anyone brilliant who read the warning and filed it under, not my problem, put it down there. Subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Clarence Daly blew glass for a living, which in the 1890s made him extremely useful to Thomas Edison because Edison needed tubes. When X-rays turned up in 1895, Edison threw himself at them and built a fluoroscope, a screen that glowed when the rays hit it, so you could look at the inside of a hand in real time. Somebody had to test the tubes. That was Daly. His method was to put his own hand between the tube and the screen and see how good the picture came out. Not once. Not as an experiment. As the daily job, for hours at a stretch, for 8 years. In May 1896, he and Edison took the fluoroscope to an exhibition in New York and ran it for the public. And nobody in that building had the faintest concept that the invisible thing making the pretty glow was doing arithmetic on their cells. The changes came slowly enough to ignore, and then all at once. His hair went, then his eyebrows and eyelashes. His face aged decades in a couple of years. His left hand swelled and stopped working properly. By 1902, there was a wound on his left wrist that wouldn't close. Surgeons tried skin grafts. The grafts failed. And then it stopped being about saving a hand and started being about staying ahead of the thing. And the surgeons kept moving further up his arms, trying to get in front of it. They never did. In 1904, it reached his chest. He was 39. He's generally counted as the first person anywhere taken by X-rays. Here's the bit that partly redeems the story. Edison had wrecked his own eyes on the same equipment, and after Daly, he stopped. Completely. Walked away from the most exciting technology in his laboratory and stayed away from it. When a reporter raised it in 1903, his answer was, "Don't talk to me about X-rays. I am afraid of them." That's one of maybe 2 people in this whole video who looked at the evidence and changed their mind. Hold that thought, because we're about to meet a man who did the exact opposite while taking notes. Number 7. Carl Patterson Schmidt was one of the great herpetologists of the 20th century. Chief curator at the Natural History Museum in Chicago. He put names on more than 200 species. If you wanted to know what a snake was, you sent it to this man, and that is exactly what the zoo across town did on the 25th of September, 1957. The package was a 30-inch snake, unidentified. Schmidt got it out to look at it properly, and while he had it in his hands, it got a fang into his left thumb. He identified it, by the way, correctly. A boomslang. Now here's what actually got him, and it wasn't the snake. It was a fact. In 1957, the professional consensus among people who knew snakes was that rear-fanged species like the boomslang couldn't get a meaningful dose into a human. The fangs sit too far back. The bite is awkward. It just doesn't work. That was the received wisdom. Schmidt was one of the people the received wisdom came from. He wasn't being arrogant when he shrugged it off. He was being current. So he didn't go to a hospital. He finished his working day at the museum. Then he went home, on the commuter train. And in fairness to him, there genuinely was no proper record of what a boomslang bite does to a person, because officially, it didn't do anything. He was about to make one. And then he did the most Carl Schmitt thing imaginable. He got out a notebook and started documenting himself. The log is extraordinary and slightly unbearable. He records his temperature. He records his meals. 6:30 the next morning. Temperature 98.2. Cereal. Poached eggs on toast. Applesauce. Coffee. A man very carefully writing down his breakfast while something is quietly dismantling his ability to clot. He notes the bleeding from his nose and mouth and describes it as, quote, not excessively. Excessively is the last word in the notebook. A few hours before the end, he was asked whether he wanted medical help. He turned it down. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because treatment would interfere with the symptoms he was recording. He had decided the data was the point, and he was not going to contaminate his own experiment. Around 1:30, he called out for his wife. By 3, it was over. He'd been at it about 24 hours. Here's what I keep circling back to. Every single part of that decision was consistent with being excellent at his job. He trusted the literature, which is what you're supposed to do. He gathered data on a phenomenon nobody had documented, which is what you're supposed to do. He was rigorous about not spoiling his own observations, which is what you're supposed to do. The notebook did change the literature. It's still cited. It's still in the museum. 60 years on, researchers went back and sequenced boomslang venom specifically to work out what had happened to him, and the paper they published has his name in the title. He got the answer he was after. Terrible way to fill in a form. Number 8. 2 survivors now, because it isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes ignoring the room is simply correct. In the early 1980s, everybody knew what caused stomach ulcers: stress and acid. And everybody knew that nothing lived in the human stomach, because the stomach is a vat of acid. And that's the end of the discussion. Barry Marshall and Robin Warren kept finding a curly little bacterium in there anyway, and kept getting told they were looking at contamination. Warren had been staring at these things in biopsy samples since the late 70s. Marshall came on board, and the two of them spent years being told, politely and then less politely, that they had misread their own slides. Their problem was they had no animal model. Nothing they could infect to prove cause. And without cause, you don't have a discovery, you have an interesting coincidence. 2 years of arguing with a wall. So in July 1984, Marshall, 32 years old, a registrar, nobody important, asked a technician to scrape the contents of 2 petri dishes into a beaker of beef broth. Then he drank it, like a shot. He didn't clear it with the hospital. He didn't clear it with his wife. Within a couple of days, his mother informed him his breath was putrid, which is the sort of feedback only a mother provides free of charge. He was bloated, off his food, and throwing up every morning. 10 days in, he had a camera put down his throat and a piece of his own stomach lining taken out, and there it was under the microscope. The bacterium and clear inflammation in tissue that had been perfectly healthy a fortnight earlier. Then he took antibiotics and cured it. The paper landed in the Medical Journal of Australia in April 1985. The Nobel Prize landed 20 years after that. And the consequence is genuinely enormous. Before this, a stomach ulcer was a thing you had for the rest of your life. Diet, stress management, medication to damp the acid down forever. After this, it's a course of antibiotics, and you're finished with it. That's the difference between managing a condition and simply removing it. So the lesson is drink the bacteria. That's what we're taking from this. Do let me know how it goes. Number 9. Werner Forssmann was 25 and had an idea everybody hated. He thought you could run a thin tube up a vein in the arm all the way into the chambers of the heart, and the heart would tolerate it. Medicine at the time believed that touching the inside of a living human heart would stop it. Not injure. Stop. His boss forbade it outright. Forssmann needed the operating theater, and he needed somebody to fetch instruments, so he went to the surgical nurse, Gerda Ditzen. She was interested. She agreed to help on one condition. He had to do it on her, not on himself. He said yes. And then he strapped her to the operating table, went through the motions of numbing her arm, and quietly numbed his own instead. I want to sit with this for a second. Here is a man in 1929 committing a small kidnapping in order to advance cardiology. He opened the crease of his own left elbow, fed in a 65-centimeter tube designed for the urinary tract, and threaded it up his arm. At some point, Ditzen glanced over and noticed the tube was not coming out of her. He untied her and asked her to ring radiology. The two of them then walked down a corridor, with a tube inside him running towards his heart. In the X-ray room, watching a fluoroscope, he pushed it the rest of the way in. The image showed the tip sitting neatly in his right atrium. He'd been inside a working human heart. Nothing stopped. His boss tore strips off him. Then, to his enormous credit, looked at the picture, understood what it meant, helped him publish it, and got him a post at the Charite in Berlin. The rest of the profession was less generous, reckless, showy, dangerous. The pressure was heavy enough that Forssmann gave up cardiology entirely and spent his career in urology, which is a bit like inventing the aeroplane and being gently encouraged to go into buses. In 1956, he got the Nobel Prize for it. 27 years later, the technique he was mocked for is now performed hundreds of thousands of times a year in every serious hospital on the planet, and it's one of the main reasons a heart attack is something you can survive. Number 10. Last one, and it's the oldest. And it might be my favorite, because the man's method was so beautifully simple. Carl Wilhelm Scheele ran a pharmacy in a small Swedish town called Köping, and he was quietly one of the most productive chemists who has ever lived. He isolated oxygen around 1771, years ahead of Priestley or Lavoisier, then took 6 years to publish, which is why you learned somebody else's name instead. Chlorine, barium, manganese, molybdenum, tungsten, citric acid, lactic acid, glycerol, hydrogen fluoride, hydrogen sulfide, all of it out of one provincial chemist shop. His technique for characterizing a new substance was thorough for the era. He'd record the color, the smell, and the taste. Yes, every time. Which brings us neatly to hydrogen cyanide, which Scheele also discovered, and which Scheele also described the taste of. In writing, for the record, he noted a faint Swedish quality and then presumably wrote the next line down and carried on with his afternoon. He worked in a back room with essentially no ventilation, breathing arsenic compounds and cyanide fumes for years on end. His health came apart in his 30s. He was gone at 43. And here's the part that turns this from a funny story into something else. He knew. He understood exactly what was happening to him. He even had a phrase for it. He called it the trouble of all apothecaries, like a bad back you get from lifting, an occupational cost you accept and keep working. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't ignorant. He'd done the arithmetic, decided the chemistry was worth it, and went back into the room. That's the list. 10 brilliant people, 10 warnings, and one very consistent habit of reading the warning and filing it under someone else's problem.